In this module, we're going to look at muscle plasticity. Plasticity is just a fancy term that means that the muscle can change and adapt to the given stimulus that's provided with training. We're going to look at training for power, we'll look at training for muscular endurance, as well as looking at muscular strength and hypertrophy. In this diagram, we're looking at peak power. On the y-axis, we have two variables listed. We have power and we have velocity. On the x-axis, we have force. It's important to note that the velocity, power, and force are all expressed relative to the maximum values for the fast fiber. So we're looking at velocity and power curves for fast and slow muscle fibers. Fast muscle fibers are better suited to instantaneous power because of their higher speed of contraction. Peak power of slow fibers is about 30% that of fast. Note that peak power is achieved at about 33% of maximum force output. Peak power occurs at about 25% of maximum force in slow fibers. So the take-home message from this slide is that we can train at about 30 to 40% of maximum force production for the most gains in peak power. This will train both the neural and muscular systems. In this graph, we're looking at sustained power. On the y-axis, we have sustained power, and on the x-axis, we have time in minutes. This diagram shows us that the fast oxidative motor units are best suited for power output over extended periods of time. Fast glycolytic fibers fatigue quickly, and slow fibers have low power outputs initially. It's important to note that not all aerobic activities are actually performed by slow motor units. In exercise science, this is considered a classic diagram outlining the strength and hypertrophy gains over the course of time. On the y-axis, we have our progress. On the x-axis, we have time in weeks. The red line represents overall strength, the blue line represents muscle hypertrophy, the white dashed line represents the neural adaptations. Initially, strength gains are mediated by neural mechanisms, which peak at 3 to 4 weeks. At that time, we get muscular hypertrophy. That is, the muscle size begins to increase, which predominates as the major contributor to strength gains. Eventually, our strength gains may plateau, which is why athletes will consider ergogenic aids such as steroids to accelerate their gains in strength. With muscle hypertrophy, it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to adjust to a new protein balance. The last point I'd like to make is that the strength line in red actually oscillates in reality even with consistent weight training. So some days we'll have higher strength and other days we'll have lower strength. So the previous slide really highlights the importance that our improvements in strength gains are really related to a favorable blend of adaptations in the muscle as well as in the neural organization. As far as the muscle adaptations are concerned, we're really talking about muscle hypertrophy. In the scientific literature and animal studies, some of the studies suggested that hyperplasia, that is the splitting of muscle cells and creating new muscle cells, is how animals increase strength. However, this has not been found to be the case in humans, and if it does exist, it's quite negligible in its contribution to overall muscle hypertrophy. With muscle hypertrophy, obviously the muscle fibers are getting bigger. The structural proteins that hold the sarcomeres in place actually bring the sarcomeres into alignment so that they're better aligned and allow for more interaction between the myosin and actin filaments. Initially, a naive weight trainer can't recruit their fastest of motor units because they are more asynchronous. So by bringing these sarcomeres back into alignment, they become more synchronous, which increases the force output. Especially with a max lift, there will be more synchrony of the sarcomeres. One of the other adaptations in muscles is that connective tissue actually increases a bit, which improves the tensile strength. As we've talked about in a previous lecture, the gating of the Golgi tendon organ, or rather disinhibition, increases the activation of the agonist. This allows for increased force production. We also decrease the activation of the antagonists. This allows for the activation of the fastest motor units. The motor units are more synchronized as well. And don't forget about reflex potentiation, that is the stretching of the passive elements. As a point of interest in the scientific literature, when we only exercise one limb with strength training, the untrained limb will also increase in strength owing to the neural adaptations that occur in the skeletal muscle. We basically have increased motor unit recruitment. So this is attractive for rehabilitation programs. So what turns the stimulus on for muscle hypertrophy to occur? Well, first and foremost, we have to have a stimulus. In other words, forceful contractions that place a mechanical stretch across the muscle fibers. That leads to sarcolemmal wounding. Remember, the sarcolemmal membrane surrounds the muscle fibers. These are micro tears in the membrane and not membrane breakdown. The sarcolemmal membrane remains completely intact. If the sarcolemmal membrane is ruptured, that's going to allow calcium to rush into the muscle cell and will trigger catabolism due to the disruption in the calcium balance within the muscle fiber. That's going to cause a lot of pain and suffering. So the mechanical stretch placed on the sarcolemmal membrane causes some micro tears, but that membrane remains intact. That's an important point to remember. This causes the release of growth factors that we'll talk about. Fibroblast growth factor, FGF, as well as insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1. FGF then causes the activation and proliferation of satellite cells. During fetal development, cells called myoblasts differentiate, and these are the cells that are going to eventually become muscle fibers. However, some of these myoblasts get trapped within the basal lamina, that's the thin layer of tissue outside of the sarcolemma, and they'll remain there until they're activated when needed with something like forceful contractions and mechanical stretch. So in other words, we're born with a certain number of satellite cells, which also begs the question of how many satellite cells do we have over the course of a lifetime to continually adapt to these forceful contractions? Interesting question. It's also interesting to note that myostatin is the hormone that's responsible for regulating the amount of muscular hypertrophy that we get. Once the satellite cells are activated, then FGF is going to increase the delivery of amino acids to the muscle cells and promote protein synthesis. So let's just review these growth factors really quickly. So we have these forceful muscular contractions that place a mechanical stretch on the sarcolemmal membrane that causes micro tears on that sarcolemmal membrane, which then promotes the release of these growth factors, FGF and IGF-1. FGF will be released from the sarcolemmal membrane in proportion to the amount of wounding or micro tears along the sarcolemmal membrane. Again, this activates and regulates satellite cell proliferation. Insulin-like growth factor 1 or IGF-1 is going to be released from inside the muscle cell or muscle fiber and then increases the amount of amino acid transport to increase protein synthesis. In the scientific literature, what we find with muscle hypertrophy is that all fibers are capable of muscle hypertrophy. It's just that the fast fibers tend to have more compared with the slow fibers. In terms of the capillary density, there doesn't seem to be much difference there, unless you're a bodybuilder who's using a low resistance and high repetition training routine. In terms of mitochondrial density, what we see is an increase in mitochondrial density in proportion to the amount of muscle mass that's created. When we compare eccentric versus concentric strength training, what we find is that with eccentric training, there's a much lower threshold for a hypertrophic response and a greater response for the same relative stimulus. So it seems that we can get improved strength gains with eccentric training compared with concentric training. The only problem is that we have to think about training specificity. How applicable are these movements to the way that they're going to be used during competition? So the greatest increases in strength are going to come from training the exact movement to be performed during competition. This is another classic diagram in exercise science. These two panels compare muscular endurance versus muscular strength. In the top panel on the y-axis we have muscle strength. On the bottom panel on the y-axis we have muscular endurance. On the x-axis we have the repetition maximum load. So these are the number of reps that are being performed. So in panel A, greater increases in strength are achieved at low repetition maximum loads, or high intensity. Whereas panel B, muscle endurance is enhanced when intensity is lower and repetitions are higher. In strength training studies, what we find is if we keep our repetitions to 3 to 8 at 80 to 95% of our 1 repetition maximum for 2 to 3 sets with 2 to 3 minute interval breaks, we're going to maximize our muscular strength. Conversely, if we want to emphasize muscular endurance, what the scientific literature suggests is that we perform 15 to 20 reps at 50 to 60% of 1 repetition maximum. The person would perform 3 to 6 sets with 30 seconds to 1 minute interval breaks. That tends to emphasize muscular endurance. If we were looking for a blend between muscular strength and endurance, what we would do is keep to 8 to 15 reps at 60 to 80% of the 1 repetition maximum. This is actually in agreement with the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines for health-related benefits from strength training. As a general rule of thumb, when we increase training volume, we get increases in strength. However, the optimal number of sets per muscle group still remains controversial in the scientific literature. It really depends on the population that you're talking about. Athletes generally require more, so about 4 to 8 sets. People who are less active, who are non-athletes, require less, like 3 to 8 sets. In an untrained individual, the scientific literature actually shows us that anywhere from 1 to 4 sets yields large gains in strength, simply because they've been sedentary and not trained. One thing that we know from the scientific literature is that a high volume of training, that is greater than 10 sets, is really not required for optimal strength gains. And of course, let's not forget about the law of diminishing returns. So the more trained you are, the less in terms of strength gains you're going to get from your training routine. Another question that often comes up is also if there's any difference between machine weights versus free weights in terms of the strength gains that you get. The current scientific literature does not support any difference between muscle hypertrophy from machine weights versus free weights. In terms of maximizing muscular strength and muscular endurance, athletes need a plan in order to be competitive. This is where periodization training comes into play. This is just an example of how periodization can work. There's actually an entire textbook revolving around this particular topic. But basically what we're going to do is divide the training period into phases where we manipulate the intensity of the exercise, the volume of the exercise, so how much we do overall, and of course how frequently we exercise. The preparation phase involves using a high volume, so 3 to 5 sets, 8 to 12 reps, with a low intensity amount of work, so 50 to 80% of that person's 1 repetition maximum. We then move into the first transition phase where we use moderate volume, so 3 to 5 sets, and then we lower the reps to 5 to 6 at a moderate intensity at 80 to 90% of 1 repetition maximum. This then moves us into the competition phase. This is the period of time where the athlete is actually competing. In this phase, what we want to do is a low volume of work, so 3 to 5 sets, 2 to 4 reps, with high intensity, 90 to 95% of 1 repetition maximum, and also emphasize sport-specific activities. This is where we want the athlete to peak with their strength, right during the competitive phase. This is where they need to be at their strongest. So it makes sense that we would peak at this particular phase. After the competitive season is over, then we move into the second transition. This is where we allow the body to recuperate and we perform non-specific, low-intensity exercise. This is a great place for cross-training type of activities. A question that often comes up is concomitant training of resistance exercise and endurance training. Can I be good at both? Can I do both at the same time and not have one overpower the other? And the answer really lies in the frequency of those activities. So for athletes, it's recommended that we do strength training and endurance training on separate days so one doesn't overpower the other.